For 3,000 years, Earth has been classified as a Class XII Deathworld, a planetary hellscape so hostile that even the most hardened galactic explorers refuse to venture there. The Galactic Council's xenobiology students study it from afar, wondering how any intelligent life could possibly emerge from such a nightmare realm. But, when humanity finally joins the galactic community, these alien scholars get their chance to ask the question that has haunted their studies: how did you survive on that monster planet? The answer they receive doesn't just challenge everything they thought they knew about survival, it shatters their understanding of what it means to be alive. This is the story of how humanity's simple response to an innocent academic question accidentally triggered the greatest philosophical revolution in galactic history, and why some truths are too terrifying for civilized minds to comprehend. The students thought they were ready for any answer. They were wrong. The lecture hall fell silent as Professor Kethvara's crystalline form shimmered with nervous energy. Her 6 manipulator arms gestured toward the holographic display showing a blue-green world that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. The assembled students from 17 different species shifted uncomfortably in their varied seating arrangements, some floating in suspension fields, others coiled on heated rocks, and a few maintaining their positions through sheer willpower. Class 12 Deathworld designation, Kethvara announced, her translator rendering her harmonic speech into Standard Galactic. Terra, also known as Earth. Atmospheric composition includes 21% oxygen, a highly corrosive gas that would dissolve most of your respiratory systems within minutes. Surface pressure variations that would crush or explode most life forms. Temperature ranges from -90 to +70 degrees standard, with seasonal variations that create continent-spanning storms. A young Berlanti student raised one of his feathered appendages, his emerald plumage quivering. Professor, the preliminary reports suggest intelligent life actually evolved there. How is that possible? That, Zeftai, is precisely why we're studying this anomaly, Kethvara replied, her form shifting to a deeper blue shade that indicated academic fascination. Not only did intelligent life evolve on this nightmare world, but it thrived. The species calls itself humanity, and their recent contact with our civilization has raised disturbing questions about our understanding of evolutionary biology. The hologram zoomed in on the planet's surface, revealing vast oceans that churned with perpetual motion. Landmasses showed scars of tectonic activity, mountain ranges thrust skyward by unimaginable forces, valleys carved by erosion, and volcanic regions that glowed with barely contained fury. Observe the oceanic systems, Kethvara continued. These water bodies are in constant motion, generating storms with wind velocities that would tear apart our strongest buildings. The electromagnetic activity during these weather events produces lightning, natural electrical discharges with enough power to vaporize most known materials. Yet humans evolved near these very waters. A Mordelian student, her serpentine body coiled around her platform, hissed in disbelief. The energy readings from those storm systems exceed the output of our defensive shields. Nothing could survive direct exposure. Precisely, Cythera. And, yet. Kethvara manipulated the display to show archived footage from humanity's first contact 3 months earlier. The humans described these storms as refreshing and invigorating. Their initial diplomatic team actually requested to open the space station's observation deck during a cosmic storm, claiming they missed the sensation of rain. The class erupted in a mixture of alarm chirps, clicks, and harmonic discordance. The very concept of voluntarily exposing oneself to a cosmic phenomenon capable of destroying starships struck them as either suicidal or evidence of severe mental deficiency. But that's not the most disturbing aspect of their physiology, Kethvara continued, waiting for the noise to subside. Their planet's gravity is nearly twice what most of us consider habitable. Their bone density and muscle mass reflect adaptation to forces that would cripple the majority of galactic species. They carry their entire body weight against a crushing gravitational field every moment of their lives. Zeftai's feathers had shifted to the pale yellow of extreme anxiety. Professor, how could evolution produce such a result? What environmental pressures could justify such brutal adaptations? That's what we're here to discover, Kethvara replied. But, first, let's examine their atmospheric composition. 21% oxygen, as mentioned, but also 78% nitrogen with trace amounts of argon and carbon dioxide. What makes this particularly fascinating is that their atmosphere is not artificially maintained, this is their natural environment. A collective shudder passed through the classroom. Most species required carefully controlled atmospheric processors to maintain habitable conditions even on their homeworlds. The idea of breathing unfiltered planetary atmosphere seemed like an elaborate form of suicide. The oxygen concentration alone presents a significant mystery, Professor Kethvara explained, her form now cycling through colors that indicated deep academic concern. At those levels, organic matter becomes highly combustible. Forest fires are not only possible but inevitable on their world. These infernos can consume millions of acres, generating temperatures that would melt our environmental suits. She paused the holographic display on an image of a massive wildfire, its flames reaching hundreds of feet into the sky while generating clouds of smoke that blotted out the sun. Humans don't just survive these events, they've learned to predict and, sometimes, control them. They call it prescribed burning and use fire as a tool for ecological management. Cythera's voice carried the harmonic equivalent of horror. They weaponize combustion for environmental control? That's like using antimatter to trim vegetation. Your comparison is more apt than you realize, Kethvara agreed. But we're only beginning to scratch the surface of Earth's hostile characteristics. Let's examine their biological neighbors. The display shifted to show various Earth creatures, starting with what appeared to be a relatively benign four-legged mammal. This is called a hippopotamus. Humans consider it one of Africa's most dangerous animals. It weighs approximately 3,000 kilograms, can run at 48 kilometers per hour, and has jaws capable of snapping a small spacecraft in half. The students stared in stunned silence as the hologram showed the creature's mouth opening to reveal teeth like ivory daggers. Now observe this, Kethvara continued, switching to footage of humans in small boats approaching these same creatures. This is considered a tourist activity. Humans voluntarily place themselves within striking distance of these predators for recreational purposes. A new student, a Gelithian whose crystalline structure pulsed with confused patterns, spoke up. Professor, surely this is some form of recorded fiction? No sapient species would deliberately court death for entertainment. I thought so too, Trill 9, until I reviewed the authentication codes. This footage is verified genuine. Kethvara's form had shifted to deep purple, indicating profound academic disturbance. But the hippopotamus is relatively benign compared to other Earth fauna. The display cycled through increasingly alarming creatures. Massive predators with serrated teeth called sharks that humans actually swam with in open water. Enormous reptiles called crocodiles that could remain motionless for hours before exploding into deadly motion. Creatures called bears that weighed up to 800 kilograms and possessed claws capable of rending metal. And here's perhaps the most disturbing example, Kethvara said, showing footage of a small, seemingly harmless blue-ringed octopus. This creature is smaller than most of your communication devices, yet carries enough venom to kill 30 adult humans within minutes. There is no known antidote. Humans are aware of this, and they study it anyway. Zeftai had gone completely white with terrormolt. They knowingly interact with lethal organisms? How did their species survive long enough to develop intelligence? That question brings us to today's primary topic, Professor Kethvara announced, her form brightening with anticipation. 3 days from now, a human delegation is visiting our university as part of the cultural exchange program. They've agreed to address advanced xenobiology classes about life on Earth. The excited murmur that rippled through the classroom was tinged with obvious fear. The opportunity to question beings who had evolved in such hostile conditions was unprecedented in galactic academia. I want each of you to prepare thoughtful questions about their world and how they survived its challenges, Kethvara continued. This is a unique chance to understand evolutionary adaptations that shouldn't theoretically be possible. How did they develop technology while sharing their world with megapredators? How did they establish civilizations in environments that would exterminate most species within hours? Cythera coiled tighter around her platform. Professor, are we certain it's safe to have them here? If they evolved on such a hostile world, might they not be dangerous themselves? The Galactic Council's Xenobiology Committee has assured us that humans are entirely peaceful, Kethvara replied, though her coloring suggested some uncertainty. Their psychological profiles indicate strong social cooperation and what they call empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. It seems paradoxical that such a brutal world could produce such apparently gentle beings. The class session continued with increasingly disturbing revelations about Earth's hostile environment. Tectonic plates that shifted without warning, creating devastating earthquakes. Weather systems that generated tornadoes with wind speeds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour. Volcanic eruptions that could alter global climate patterns. Asteroid impacts that had caused mass extinctions. Yet through all of these catastrophes, Professor Kethvara concluded, not only did life persist on Earth, it flourished. And, somehow, in the midst of this planetary chaos, humanity developed art, music, literature, and philosophy. They created beauty while surrounded by destruction. As the students filed out of the lecture hall, their conversations buzzed with nervous anticipation and barely controlled fear. Never before had they encountered a species that had survived such hostile conditions. The questions they would ask in 3 days might fundamentally change their understanding of what life could endure. Zeftai lingered after class, his plumage still pale with anxiety. Professor, what if their answers reveal something we're not prepared to understand? What if the universe is far more dangerous than we've allowed ourselves to believe? Professor Kethvara's form cycled through several colors before settling on a deep amber that indicated profound uncertainty. That, Zeftai, is exactly what terrifies me. We've built our civilizations on the assumption that life seeks safety and comfort. If humanity proves that assumption wrong, we may need to reconsider everything we think we know about existence itself. The holographic display still showed Earth spinning slowly in the darkness, its surface scarred by eons of violence yet somehow beautiful in its terrible complexity. In 3 days, they would finally get their answers about this impossible world and the creatures who called it home. None of them suspected that those answers would forever change not just their understanding of humanity, but their perception of what it truly meant to be alive in a universe far stranger and more wondrous than they had ever dared imagine. The morning of the human visit dawned with unusual electromagnetic activity around Kethvar University's orbital station. 3 transport pods had docked during the night cycle, their occupants now somewhere within the sprawling academic complex that served as the galaxy's premier center for xenobiological studies. Word had spread beyond Professor Kethvara's advanced class. Students from dozens of departments had requested permission to attend what was being called the Deathworld lecture. Dr. Sarachin adjusted the unfamiliar breathing apparatus that allowed her to survive in the station's standard atmosphere while her colleagues, Dr. Michael Reeves and Dr. Elena Vasquez, made similar preparations in the holding chamber adjacent to the main lecture hall. Through the transparent aluminum walls, they could see hundreds of alien beings arranging themselves in the vast amphitheater, a sight that still sent chills of wonder down Sarah's spine despite 3 months of diplomatic contact. Remember, Elena whispered, her voice carrying through the communication links, they see our world as a cosmic horror story. Try not to sound too enthusiastic when describing avalanches or hurricanes. Michael chuckled, a sound that apparently translated poorly through the universal communicators based on the startled reactions from nearby Verlanti technicians. Too late for that. I already told the cultural liaison that I missed the smell of rain and petrichor. You should have seen his face, or what I think was his face. Sarah watched as the alien students continued filing in, noting how many different environmental suits and life support systems were represented. Some species required gravity 3 times lighter than Earth normal, others needed constant magnetic field generators, and several seemed to exist in specialized suspension fields that maintained their particular energy matrices. The sheer diversity of life support needs drove home just how unusual their own physiology must seem. Dr. Chen, came a harmonic voice through the translator, the assembly is ready for your presentation. Sarah nodded to her colleagues and stepped through the airlock into the main hall. The collective intake of breath, or whatever passed for breath among 17 different species, was audible even through the translation systems. She realized that many of these students had never seen an unmodified human before, let alone one who wasn't wearing full environmental protection. Professor Kethvara's crystalline form approached the podium area, her coloration cycling through what Sarah had learned were patterns of formal academic greeting. Honored colleagues from Earth, welcome to Kethvar University. Our students have prepared many questions about your remarkable world and how your species survived its challenges. Thank you for having us, Sarah replied, noting how her normal speaking voice caused several students to recoil slightly. She made a mental note to speak more softly. We're excited to share our experiences and learn from your perspectives. The first question came from a young Verlanti whose emerald plumage was already pale with anxiety. Dr. Chen, our studies indicate that Earth experiences regular seismic events capable of destroying cities. How did humanity develop permanent settlements knowing they could be annihilated without warning? Sarah paused, trying to frame her response in terms that wouldn't cause a panic. Well, Zeftai, we learned to build structures that could flex and move with seismic activity rather than resist it. In Japan, for example, we developed architectural techniques that allow buildings to sway during earthquakes rather than breaking apart. You deliberately construct buildings to move? The question came from a Mordelian student whose serpentine body had coiled so tightly around her platform that Sarah worried about circulation. That sounds like controlled structural failure. In a way, it is, Sarah agreed. We learned that rigid structures break under stress, so we designed flexibility into our architecture. The buildings are meant to bend without breaking, like a tree swaying in the wind rather than snapping. The mention of wind caused a collective shudder through the audience. Professor Kefvera's form shifted to concerned purple. Dr. Chen, perhaps you could explain why humans chose to remain in seismically active areas rather than relocating to safer regions? Sarah exchanged glances with her colleagues, seeing her own realization reflected in their eyes. The aliens weren't just asking about survival, they were asking why humans hadn't fled from danger when it became apparent. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding, Sarah began carefully. We didn't stay in dangerous areas despite the risks. We stayed because they're our home. And, in many ways, the geological activity that makes these regions dangerous also makes them beneficial. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the environmental systems cycling throughout the massive hall. Beneficial? The word came from a Gelithian student whose crystalline structure was pulsing with confused patterns. Dr. Chen, how could planetary destruction be beneficial? Michael stepped forward, his expertise in geology making him the natural choice to tackle this question. Volcanic activity, for instance, creates some of the most fertile soil on Earth. The volcanic ash contains minerals that support incredibly productive agriculture. Some of our most populous regions exist specifically because of ongoing geological processes. You farm in the shadow of active volcanoes? This from another Verlanti, whose feathers had gone completely white. The slopes of Mount Vesuvius support some of Italy's finest vineyards, Elena added with obvious enthusiasm before catching herself and moderating her tone. The soil there is exceptionally rich because of regular volcanic activity over thousands of years. Professor Kefvera's form was cycling rapidly through colors Sarah didn't recognize, apparently emotions for which the translator had no reference. You cultivate agriculture using the byproducts of planetary catastrophe. This suggests a fundamentally different relationship with geological instability than we had theorized. I suppose it is different, Sarah acknowledged. We learned early in our development that Earth's dynamic systems, whether geological activity, ecological cycles, they're not separate from life, they're part of what makes life possible. Our planet's activity doesn't just threaten us, it sustains us. A new student, this one from a species Sarah didn't recognize, something that looked like a cross between a jellyfish and a solar panel, spoke up. Dr. Chen, our atmospheric analysis indicates that Earth experiences electrical storms with discharge potentials exceeding our spacecraft's defensive capabilities. How do humans survive these events? Sarah felt a smile tugging at her lips despite her efforts to remain serious. Lightning storms? We've learned to predict them and take appropriate precautions. But many humans actually enjoy watching thunderstorms. The alien's response was a pattern of lights that the translator rendered as confused terror. Enjoy? Professor Kefvera's voice carried harmonic overtones that suggested the concept was literally incomprehensible. You find pleasure in observing potentially lethal electromagnetic phenomena? There's something beautiful about the raw power of nature, Michael explained, trying to find words that wouldn't sound completely insane. The sight of lightning illuminating storm clouds, the sound of thunder, the smell of rain on hot pavement, it's moving. You find electromagnetic discharge emotionally affecting? The question came from multiple students simultaneously, their various communication methods creating a cacophony of confusion. Elena stepped forward, recognizing that they were approaching a critical communication barrier. I think we need to address something fundamental here. You're asking how we survived Earth's dangers, but you're assuming that we see them purely as threats. That's not quite accurate. Dr. Vasquez, Professor Kefvera said, her form now stabilizing on a deep amber that Sarah recognized as academic concentration. Are you suggesting that humans don't perceive these environmental factors as dangerous? We perceive them as dangerous, Elena clarified, but also as necessary. Earth's weather systems, geological activity, even the presence of large predators, they're all part of the complex system that made our evolution possible. We don't see them as external threats to be avoided, but as integral parts of our world to be understood and respected. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute before a Mordelian student asked, Dr. Vasquez, are you implying that humans deliberately seek out dangerous conditions? Sarah decided it was time for complete honesty. Some of us do, yes. We call it adventure sports activities like mountain climbing, deep-sea diving, storm chasing, or freefall parachuting. We actively pursue experiences that many species would consider life-threatening. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Several students' life support systems activated emergency protocols. Others began rapid retreat toward the exits. A few Verlanti students went into what appeared to be defensive molt, their feathers falling like snow across the auditorium floor. Professor Kethvara's form was cycling through colors so rapidly that Sarah wondered if the emotional state being expressed even had a translation. When she finally spoke, her harmonic voice carried undertones that the translators struggled to render. Dr. Chen, Dr. Reeves, Dr. Vasquez, you're telling us that members of your species voluntarily engage in potentially lethal activities for recreational purposes? That's correct, Michael confirmed, apparently deciding that complete honesty was their only option. Humans often seek out challenging or dangerous experiences because overcoming those challenges provides a sense of accomplishment and personal growth. Personal growth? The concept seemed to break something in the translation matrix. You risk individual survival for psychological development? Well, yes, Sarah replied. Facing challenges, even dangerous ones, helps us learn about our capabilities and limitations. It builds confidence, teaches problem-solving skills, and provides perspective on what's truly important in life. A Jalithian student whose structure had gone completely dark finally found his voice. You deliberately place yourselves in mortal danger to achieve emotional satisfaction? Elena nodded. For many humans, the greatest rewards come from overcoming the greatest challenges. Risk isn't something to be eliminated, it's something to be understood, managed, and sometimes embraced. The profound silence that followed this statement was broken only by the sound of environmental systems and the occasional harmonic whisper between shocked students. Professor Kethvara seemed to be struggling with concepts that challenged the very foundations of galactic civilization. Dr. Chen, she finally managed, this suggests a relationship with mortality that we may not have adequate frameworks to understand. Are you saying that humans don't prioritize individual survival above all other considerations? Sarah looked out at the sea of alien faces, crystalline forms pulsing with confusion, feathered beings trembling with molt, serpentine creatures coiled in defensive postures, energy beings flickering with unstable patterns. She realized they were approaching the heart of what made humanity unique in the galactic community. Professor Kethvara, I think we prioritize survival differently than you might expect. Individual survival isn't our highest value, it's one value among many others, including personal growth, protecting others, advancing knowledge, creating beauty, and contributing to something larger than ourselves. You would risk individual termination for abstract concepts? Every day, Michael answered quietly. Human parents risk their lives to protect their children. Soldiers risk death to defend their communities. Researchers risk danger to advance knowledge. Artists risk poverty to create beauty. It's not that we don't value life, we value it so much that we're willing to risk it for things that make life meaningful. As the implications of this revelation settled over the assembled students, Sarah realized that they had just fundamentally challenged every assumption the galactic community held about intelligent behavior. They weren't just explaining how humans had survived Earth's dangers, they were revealing a completely alien philosophy of existence that prioritized meaning over safety, growth over comfort, and purpose over mere survival. The questions that followed would probe even deeper into this philosophical chasm, forcing both species to confront truths about life, death, and the nature of consciousness that neither was prepared to understand. The emergency brake had been called after 3 Verlanti students required medical attention for stress-induced molt and a Jalithian had experienced what their species called cognitive crystal fracture, apparently their equivalent of a nervous breakdown. Professor Kethvara had spent the intermission consulting with the university's xenopsychology department, trying to determine if it was safe to continue the session. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the holding chamber with her colleagues, watching through the transparent walls as alien medical teams attended to the affected students. The sight of beings so sophisticated that they could travel between stars being overwhelmed by simple descriptions of human behavior was both humbling and troubling. Maybe we should tone down the next part, Elena suggested, adjusting her breathing apparatus. We've already given them enough to process for a lifetime. I don't think toning it down is an option anymore, Michael replied, observing how several students had chosen to attend the second session via remote hologram rather than risk physical proximity to the humans. They need to understand, or this cultural exchange is going to fail before it starts. Sarah nodded in agreement. They asked us here to explain how we survived on a Deathworld. We can't give them a sanitized version that protects their worldview. That wouldn't be honest, and it certainly wouldn't be helpful. Professor Kethvara approached their chamber, her crystalline form now displaying a pattern Sarah had learned indicated formal academic determination mixed with barely controlled terror. Doctors, the university administration has decided to continue the session, but we must ask, are there any aspects of human behavior that you consider particularly disturbing to other species? The three humans exchanged glances. Professor, Sarah began carefully, I think everything about human behavior is going to be disturbing to species that evolved in safer environments. The question is whether you want to understand us or whether you want to preserve comfortable illusions. Understanding, Kethvara replied immediately, though her coloration suggested significant internal conflict. The implications of your previous answers have already begun circulating through academic networks. We must pursue complete comprehension, regardless of the psychological cost. As they re-entered the main hall, Sarah noticed that the student population had actually increased despite the earlier medical emergencies. Representatives from species she didn't recognize filled additional seating areas, and the holographic attendance indicators showed connections from universities across 3 sectors of the galaxy. Word was spreading that something unprecedented was happening at Kethvar. Before we continue, Professor Kethvara announced to the assembly, I want to establish new protocols for this session. Students experiencing acute psychological distress should immediately activate their emergency beacons. Medical teams are standing by. This discussion may challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligent life. A new voice emerged from the crowd, a delegate from the university's philosophy department whose species appeared to be composed entirely of shifting geometric patterns. Doctors, your previous statements suggest that humans actively seek danger for psychological benefits. Could you elaborate on this concept of personal growth through adversity? Dr. Elena Vasquez stepped forward, recognizing that they had reached the philosophical heart of the discussion. In human psychology, we have a concept called post-traumatic growth. It's the idea that individuals can emerge from challenging or even traumatic experiences with greater resilience, deeper relationships, stronger personal values, and a more profound appreciation for life. You improve through damage? The geometric being's patterns shifted to configurations that the translator rendered as academic bewilderment. This contradicts every established principle of psychological well-being. Not damage, exactly, Elena clarified. Challenge. When humans face difficulties, whether environmental dangers, personal losses, or complex problems, we often develop new capabilities and perspectives that wouldn't have emerged otherwise. We call it adversarial growth. A Mordelian student who had remained coiled in the most defensive posture possible managed to ask, Dr. Vasquez, are you suggesting that suffering is beneficial? Not suffering for its own sake, Elena replied carefully. But humans have observed that avoiding all challenges and difficulties tends to result in psychological weakness and an inability to cope with inevitable problems. We've learned that controlled exposure to manageable challenges builds resilience. Michael stepped forward to add a practical dimension to the discussion. In human child rearing, for example, we don't try to eliminate all risks from our children's environment. We gradually expose them to age-appropriate challenges so they learn to assess risks, develop problem-solving skills, and build confidence in their abilities. The silence that followed this statement was punctuated by the sound of several life support systems activating stress response protocols. Professor Kethvara's form had gone completely gray, apparently the crystalline equivalent of shocked speechlessness. Dr. Reeves, she finally managed, you deliberately expose your offspring to danger? Controlled danger, Michael emphasized. Children learn to walk by falling down and getting back up. They learn to interact with others through conflicts and reconciliations. They learn to solve problems by facing problems that are difficult but not overwhelming. A new student, a floating energy being that communicated through light patterns, flickered a question that the translator took several seconds to parse. You believe that protection from all harm is detrimental to development? Sarah took a deep breath, recognizing that they were about to cross another philosophical threshold. Yes, we do. Humans who are protected from all challenges, failures, and difficulties often develop what we call learned helplessness and inability to cope with problems when they inevitably arise. We believe that reasonable exposure to manageable risks is essential for healthy development. But, what about species preservation? The question came from a Verlanti whose plumage had stabilized at a color Sarah associated with desperate confusion. How can deliberately exposing individuals to harm serve the survival of the species? Because, Sarah replied, individual resilience contributes to species resilience. Humans who can adapt to changing conditions, solve novel problems, and recover from setbacks are more likely to survive unexpected challenges. Our species' survival isn't just about protecting individuals, it's about developing the collective capability to handle whatever the universe might throw at us. The philosophical implications were clearly overwhelming the assembled students. Sarah could see various forms of academic distress manifesting across multiple species, color changes, pattern disruptions, defensive posturing, and what appeared to be several cases of temporary system shutdown among the energy-based beings. Dr. Chen, Professor Kefvara said, her voice carrying harmonic overtones that suggested she was approaching some kind of conceptual breakthrough, you're describing a survival strategy based on adaptation rather than protection. Your species deliberately develops the capacity to handle unknown threats rather than eliminating known ones. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. We can't predict every challenge we might face, so we focus on building the ability to handle unexpected challenges. This requires accepting risk as a permanent feature of existence rather than something to be eliminated. A student from a species Sarah hadn't encountered before, something that appeared to be a mobile crystal formation, asked a question that took the translator nearly a minute to process. This implies that humans view uncertainty as valuable? Michael nodded enthusiastically. Uncertainty keeps us adaptive. If everything were predictable and safe, we'd become complacent. Humans often say that necessity is the mother of invention. We develop our greatest capabilities when we're forced to solve difficult problems under challenging conditions. You celebrate uncertainty? The crystal being's structure was shifting in patterns that suggested profound cognitive dissonance. You view unpredictability as beneficial rather than threatening? We view it as both, Elena explained. Uncertainty is threatening, but it's also the source of possibility. Every challenge is also an opportunity. Every problem we solve makes us more capable of solving future problems. Humans often choose uncertainty over security when the uncertainty offers potential for growth. The realization that was dawning across the assembled students was almost visible. Their entire galactic civilization was built on the principle of maximizing safety and predictability. They had developed technologies to eliminate environmental variables, social structures to prevent conflict, and philosophical frameworks that prioritized stability above all else. Now they were confronting a species that had developed in the exact opposite direction. Dr. Vasquez, came a trembling question from a Mordelian student: if humans value challenge and uncertainty, how do you maintain social stability? How do you prevent destructive conflict? Elena smiled, an expression that seemed to cause additional distress among the more sensitive students. We don't prevent conflict, we channel it constructively. Humans compete with each other constantly, but we've learned to do it in ways that benefit everyone. We call it constructive competition. You deliberately create internal conflict within your society? Professor Kefvara's form was cycling through colors Sarah was certain had never appeared in their previous conversations. Competition drives innovation, Michael explained. When humans compete to solve problems, create art, excel in sports, or achieve goals, everyone benefits from the improved solutions, enhanced creativity, and better performance that results. Conflict isn't something to eliminate, it's energy to be directed toward positive outcomes. A Jalithian student whose structure had been flickering unstably throughout the session finally managed to formulate a question. Are you telling us that humans have built their entire civilization on principles that every other species considers fundamentally destructive? Sarah looked around the vast hall, seeing the mixture of fascination and terror in hundreds of alien faces. I think that might be accurate, she admitted. We've built our civilization on uncertainty, challenge, conflict, risk, and change. We see these forces as creative rather than destructive, as opportunities rather than threats. But how do you maintain psychological stability? The question came from multiple students simultaneously, suggesting this was the issue that was causing the most distress. We don't try to maintain psychological stability, Sarah replied, recognizing that this answer was going to cause another crisis but knowing it needed to be said. We try to develop psychological resilience. Humans expect to experience fear, sadness, anger, loss, and uncertainty. We see these emotions as normal parts of life rather than problems to be solved. The wave of shock that rippled through the audience was palpable. Several more students activated emergency medical protocols, and Sarah could see emergency response teams moving into position around the hall's perimeter. Professor Kethvara's form had now stabilized on a deep purple that Sarah was beginning to associate with existential crisis. Dr. Chen, you're describing a species that has deliberately chosen to live in a state that every other known civilization would consider chronic psychological trauma. No, Sarah corrected gently, we're describing a species that has learned to find meaning, purpose, and even joy within conditions that other species might find traumatic. The difference is crucial. We don't suffer because we choose challenge, we thrive because we've learned to transform challenge into growth. As the implications of humanity's radically different approach to existence settled over the assembly, Sarah realized they had just revealed something that would force the entire galactic community to reconsider their understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of civilization itself. They weren't just explaining how humans had survived a death world, they were demonstrating that the entire galactic community might have been avoiding the very experiences that could have made them stronger. The emergency session of the Galactic Council's Xenobiology Committee convened while the human delegates were still answering questions in Lecture Hall 7. Representatives from 43 different species connected via quantum entanglement links, their various forms of communication creating a babble of harmonic frequencies, light patterns, electromagnetic pulses, and chemical signatures that the translation matrices struggled to coordinate. Dr. Sarah Chen was unaware of this panic among galactic leadership as she watched yet another student require medical assistance. This time it was a young energy being whose coherent field patterns had destabilized when she explained the human concept of constructive criticism, the deliberate seeking out of negative feedback to improve performance. Perhaps, Professor Kethvara suggested with obvious reluctance, we should address the implications of what we've learned. Doctors, if humans actively seek challenge and uncertainty, how do you explain your apparent success as a civilization? By our metrics, societies that embrace instability should collapse within generations. Dr. Michael Reeves recognized the deeper question being asked. Professor, I think you're operating under a different definition of stability than we are. You seem to equate stability with the absence of change, while humans equate stability with the ability to handle change effectively. Could you elaborate on this distinction? The request came from a Mordelian delegate who had joined via holographic projection rather than risk physical presence in the hall. Consider a tree in a windstorm, Elena offered, drawing on her background in environmental psychology. A rigid tree breaks in strong winds, while a flexible tree bends and survives. Which one is more stable, the one that maintains its exact shape until it snaps, or the one that adapts its shape to accommodate changing conditions? A collective shudder passed through the assembly at the mention of windstorms, but several students seemed to be grappling with the philosophical implications. A Jalithian whose crystalline structure had been pulsing erratically finally managed to ask, Dr. Vasquez, are you suggesting that adaptation is more important than preservation? For humans, yes, Elena confirmed. We believe that change is the only constant in the universe. Fighting change is futile and, ultimately destructive. Embracing change, learning to flow with it, direct it, and benefit from it, that's what we consider true stability. The questions that followed revealed just how fundamentally different human and galactic perspectives had become. Where galactic species sought to create perfect conditions and maintain them indefinitely, humans had learned to thrive in imperfect conditions and improve them continuously. Where other species tried to eliminate variables, humans had learned to manage variables. Where others sought certainty, humans had learned to navigate uncertainty. Dr. Chen, came a carefully modulated question from what appeared to be a delegation of senior academic officials. Could you explain how human child rearing produces psychologically functional adults when it involves deliberate exposure to challenge? Sarah smiled, remembering her own childhood and the lessons that had seemed harsh at the time but had proven invaluable in adulthood. Human children learn through what we call graduated challenge. We start with very small difficulties. Learning to walk involves falling down repeatedly. Learning to communicate involves being misunderstood. Learning to socialize involves conflict and reconciliation. You allow your offspring to experience failure? The horror in the translator's rendering of this question was unmistakable. We require it, Sarah replied firmly. Failure is how humans learn. A child who never fails at anything never learns to recover from failure. When they eventually encounter a challenge they can't overcome, and everyone eventually does, they have no coping mechanisms. Michael stepped forward to add context. Human education is built around progressive challenge. We give children problems that are just beyond their current ability level, then help them develop the skills and resilience needed to solve those problems. Each success builds confidence, each failure builds wisdom. But what about psychological damage? The question came from a species Sarah hadn't seen before, beings that appeared to exist as coherent probability clouds. How do you prevent trauma? We don't prevent all trauma, Elena explained, causing another wave of shock through the assembly. We help children develop the emotional tools to process trauma when it occurs. Humans have learned that the goal isn't to live a life free of difficult experiences, it's to become the kind of person who can handle difficult experiences when they inevitably arise. Professor Kethvera's form had stabilized on a deep amber that Sarah now recognized as the color of profound academic concentration mixed with existential uncertainty. Dr. Vasquez, this suggests that humans view adversity as educational? Adversity is the universe's most effective teacher, Elena confirmed. Comfortable conditions don't require growth or adaptation. Challenging conditions force us to discover capabilities we didn't know we possessed. Many of humanity's greatest achievements have come from individuals who overcame significant obstacles. A new voice entered the conversation, a delegate from the Galactic Council's Cultural Preservation Committee whose harmonic patterns suggested extreme agitation. Doctors, are you implying that the galactic community's approach to protecting member species from environmental challenges is counterproductive? Sarah felt the weight of the question and its implications. The entire galactic civilization was built on the principle of providing safe, stable, predictable environments for all member species. They had eliminated weather, standardized atmospheric conditions, prevented geological activity, and created vast networks of protected worlds where citizens could live without ever encountering uncertainty or danger. I can't speak to galactic policy, Sarah replied carefully, but I can tell you that in human experience, the elimination of all challenge and uncertainty tends to produce individuals who are incredibly fragile when unexpected difficulties arise. Fragile? The word seemed to resonate through the assembly with particular impact. Michael nodded. Without regular exposure to manageable challenges, humans lose their ability to cope with stress, solve novel problems, or adapt to changing conditions. We call it learned helplessness, the psychological state of believing you can't handle difficulties because you've never had to learn how. The silence that followed was broken by a question from a Verlanti student whose plumage had gone completely white. Dr. Reeves, are you suggesting that the galactic community's citizens might be psychologically unprepared for unexpected challenges? I don't know enough about galactic psychology to make that judgment, Michael replied diplomatically. But I can tell you that humans who are raised in completely protected environments often struggle when they encounter their first real difficulties as adults. Professor Kethvera's form began cycling through colors rapidly, apparently emotions for which there were no translations. The implications of this perspective are troubling. Our entire civilization is predicated on the elimination of uncertainty and challenge. Maybe that's not a problem, Sarah offered, trying to provide some comfort to the obviously distressed beings around her. Different species might require different approaches to well-being. What works for humans might not work for other forms of life. But what if it does? The question came from a young Jalithian student whose crystal structure was pulsing with patterns Sarah associated with intellectual excitement rather than distress. What if every species could benefit from controlled challenge and uncertainty? Before any of the humans could respond, Professor Kethvera received what appeared to be an urgent communication through her internal systems. Her form shifted to deep purple as she processed the information. Doctors, she announced, I've just received word that your presentation is being broadcast live to academic institutions across 17 sectors. Your descriptions of human psychology and society have generated significant interest throughout the galactic community. Significant interest? Elena asked, noting the professor's obvious distress. Several member worlds are requesting immediate cultural exchanges with Earth. Others are demanding emergency sessions of the Galactic Council to address the implications of human philosophy for galactic social policy. And she paused, her form cycling through colors that suggested profound uncertainty. Some species are beginning to question whether their own protective environmental policies might be limiting their development. Sarah felt a chill of realization. They hadn't just explained human survival strategies, they had accidentally triggered a crisis of confidence in the fundamental principles of galactic civilization. The alien students weren't just learning about humanity, they were beginning to question everything they had been taught about safety, growth, and the nature of a good life. Professor Kethvera, Sarah said carefully, What exactly are the other species questioning? Everything, came the reply in harmonic tones that the translator rendered as barely controlled panic. Your presentation has suggested that the galactic community might have been optimizing for the wrong variables. Instead of maximizing safety and comfort, we might need to be maximizing adaptability and resilience. Michael exchanged concerned glances with his colleagues. That wasn't our intention. We were just explaining how Earth's environment shaped human development. But, the logical implications are inescapable, Professor Kethvara continued. If challenge and uncertainty promote psychological growth, then, our protected environments might be preventing growth. If controlled risk builds resilience, then, our risk elimination might be creating fragility. If adaptation is more valuable than preservation, then, our entire approach to civilization might be fundamentally flawed. The weight of what they had unleashed was becoming clear. Sarah looked around the hall at hundreds of alien beings whose worldviews were crumbling in real time. They had come here to satisfy academic curiosity about a Deathworld species, but instead they had discovered that the Deathworld approach to life might be superior to their own carefully constructed paradise. What happens now? Elena asked quietly. Professor Kethvara's form had stabilized on a color Sarah had never seen before, something that seemed to combine hope, terror, and desperate determination. Now, Dr. Vasquez, we have to decide whether to suppress this knowledge to preserve social stability, or embrace it and fundamentally restructure our understanding of what it means to live a meaningful life. As the implications continued to ripple through the assembly, Sarah realized that this academic lecture had become something far more significant, a moment when one civilization discovered that everything they believed about safety, happiness, and the good life might be wrong. The question now was whether they would have the courage to face that truth and transform themselves, or whether they would retreat into the comfortable illusions that had defined their existence for millennia. The answer would determine not just the future of human-alien relations, but the trajectory of galactic civilization itself. 6 months after the lecture that shattered galactic assumptions about intelligent life, Dr. Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Deep Space Cultural Exchange Station, watching as ships from dozens of worlds approached through the void. The station itself was a compromise between human engineering principles and galactic safety standards, designed to withstand uncertainty while providing the controlled environment most species required for survival. The aftermath of what galactic media had termed the Deathworld revelation had been chaotic. 3 member worlds had petitioned to withdraw from the Galactic Council's environmental protection programs. 7 species had requested immediate cultural exchange programs with Earth to study human approaches to child-rearing and education. The Verlanti Confederation had actually voted to reintroduce weather to their homeworld, a decision that had caused mass evacuations to other systems as their population split between those who wanted to experience natural atmospheric variation and those who considered the proposal tantamount to genocide. Dr. Chen, came a familiar harmonic voice through the translation system. Professor Kethvara approached, her crystalline form displaying the deep blue patterns Sarah had learned to associate with determined academic resolve. The council representatives have arrived for the final session. Sarah turned from the viewport, noting how much the professor's emotional coloring had changed over the past months. Where once she had displayed the steady amber of academic confidence, now she showed the shifting patterns of someone grappling with fundamental questions about existence itself. How are the other participants handling the preparation? Sarah asked, referring to the unprecedented gathering that had brought together representatives from 47 species, all seeking to understand the implications of humanity's approach to life and growth. With significant difficulty, Professor Kethvara admitted. The Mordelian delegation required extensive psychological support just to travel here. The Jalithian Council is split between those who want to implement controlled uncertainty protocols and those who consider such measures to be civilizational suicide. And, the Verlanti, well, half their population is now living on terraformed worlds that include weather systems. They walked together through corridors designed to accommodate the wildly different environmental needs of dozens of species. Sarah passed chambers filled with the crystalline growth medium preferred by silicon-based lifeforms, atmospheric processors maintaining the complex gas mixtures needed by energy beings, and gravity adjustment fields that allowed massive creatures to coexist with delicate flying species. Dr. Chen, Professor Kethvara said as they approached the main assembly hall, I need to ask you something that has been troubling me since your original presentation. Are humans truly happy living with so much uncertainty and challenge? Sarah paused, considering the question carefully. That's complicated, Professor. Humans experience a wide range of emotions, including fear, sadness, and anxiety when facing difficulties. But we've learned that happiness isn't the absence of negative emotions. For most humans, the deepest satisfaction comes from overcoming challenges, growing as individuals, and contributing to something larger than ourselves. Even when it involves pain? Especially when it involves pain, Sarah replied honestly. Human mothers experience significant physical pain during childbirth, but most describe it as the most meaningful experience of their lives. Human athletes push their bodies to exhaustion and injury to achieve excellence in their sports. Human students struggle with difficult concepts that cause frustration and confusion because mastering those concepts brings deep satisfaction. Professor Kethvera's form shifted to patterns Sarah associated with deep contemplation. We're about to ask the galactic community to consider deliberately introducing elements of difficulty into their lives. I need to understand, are we asking them to sacrifice happiness for growth? No, Sarah said firmly. We're asking them to consider that there might be forms of happiness they've never experienced, the joy of overcoming obstacles, the satisfaction of developing new capabilities, the deep contentment that comes from knowing you can handle whatever life brings you. They entered the vast assembly hall where representatives from across the galaxy had gathered for what was being called the Civilizational Choice Conference. The sight was extraordinary: beings of crystalline structure, energy patterns, biological forms that defied easy description, and mechanical intelligences that existed as distributed consciousness across multiple platforms. All had come to wrestle with the same question: should galactic civilization fundamentally change its approach to life? Dr. Elena Vasquez and Dr. Michael Reeves were already at the central presentation area, reviewing data that had been collected from the few species brave enough to experiment with controlled challenge protocols over the past months. The results had been mixed but intriguing. Some individuals showed remarkable growth in problem-solving abilities and emotional resilience, while others had experienced significant psychological distress. Honored delegates, Professor Kethvera announced, her harmonic voice carrying throughout the hall, we are here to address a question that challenges the very foundations of our civilization. The human model of development through adversity has proven effective for their species, but we must determine whether it has applications for the broader galactic community. A representative from the Jalithian consensus, a being whose crystalline structure pulsed with authoritative patterns, spoke first. Our preliminary experiments with uncertainty protocols have produced measurable improvements in adaptive capacity among volunteers. However, they have also caused significant psychological distress in roughly 30% of participants. This was followed by a report from the Verlanti Confederation, where the reintroduction on Verlanti Prime has resulted in a 20% increase in creative output among our artists and inventors, but also a 15% increase in emergency medical interventions. The population remains divided on whether this trade-off is acceptable. Species after species presented similar findings. The introduction of manageable challenges and controlled uncertainty seemed to promote growth and innovation, but at the cost of the absolute safety and comfort that had defined galactic civilization for millennia. Sarah stepped forward when invited to address the assembly. Honored delegates, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what we're proposing. We're not suggesting that every species adopt Earth-specific environmental conditions or risk levels. We're suggesting that each species experiment with finding their own optimal balance between safety and challenge. Could you elaborate on this distinction, Dr. Chen? The question came from a distributed intelligence that existed across multiple platforms throughout the hall. Humans evolved on a chaotic world, so we developed tolerance for high levels of uncertainty and physical risk. But the principle underlying our development, that appropriate challenges promote growth, might apply to other species in different ways. A species that communicates through harmonic resonance might benefit from controlled discord. A species that processes information through crystalline matrices might grow from exposure to pattern disruption. The specific challenges would be different for each species. Dr. Michael Reeves added supporting context: the key insight isn't that everyone should live on Deathworlds. It's that completely eliminating challenge and uncertainty might be preventing growth that could occur through species-appropriate forms of controlled adversity. A long debate followed, with representatives grappling with concepts that had no precedent in their experience. How do you introduce uncertainty without causing chaos? How do you create challenges without risking lives? How do you balance individual safety with potential collective growth? Finally, a young delegate from a species Sarah didn't recognize stood up. Their translator rendered their communication as, "I volunteer." The silence that followed was profound. I volunteer to be part of an experimental program, the being continued. My species has lived in perfect environmental control for 3,000 years. We are safe, comfortable, and completely stagnant. We haven't produced a new idea, created original art, or solved a novel problem in centuries. If controlled challenge might help us grow, I want to try it. The statement triggered a cascade of similar declarations throughout the hall. Species after species volunteered to participate in carefully designed experiments with uncertainty, challenge, and controlled adversity. Not all were willing. Nearly half of the represented civilizations chose to maintain their current safety-focused approaches. But enough volunteered to create an unprecedented galactic experiment in alternative approaches to civilization. Professor Kethvara's form was cycling through colors Sarah had never seen before, apparently emotions for which no translation existed. Dr. Chen, we are about to divide galactic civilization between those who choose growth through challenge and those who choose safety through protection. The consequences of this choice will reshape our entire understanding of what intelligent life can become. Professor, Sarah replied, I think you're about to discover what humans learned long ago, that there's no such thing as perfect safety, and there's no growth without risk. The universe doesn't care about our comfort zones. The choice isn't between safety and danger, it's between prepared adaptation and unprepared vulnerability. As the conference concluded with formal protocols for the establishment of development through adversity experimental worlds, Sarah realized that humanity's simple answer to an academic question about survival had evolved into something unprecedented, the conscious evolution of galactic civilization itself. Some species would continue seeking perfect safety and comfort, maintaining their stable but static existence. Others would begin the uncertain journey toward growth through challenge, accepting risk as the price of advancement. Neither approach was wrong, but both would lead to fundamentally different futures. The galaxy had learned that there were multiple ways to be intelligent, multiple approaches to civilization, and multiple definitions of a life well lived. Humans had shown them that survival wasn't just about avoiding death, it was about making life meaningful enough to be worth the risks involved. As ships departed the station carrying representatives back to their homeworlds, Sarah watched the void beyond the viewport and smiled. The universe was vast, uncertain, and full of challenges that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. But now the galaxy had two different philosophies for facing that reality, and the courage to choose between them would define the future of intelligent life itself. In the end, the aliens' question about why Earth was a death world had revealed something far more profound. Earth wasn't a death world at all. It was simply a world where life had learned to dance with danger, to find beauty in chaos, and to transform challenge into strength. The real question wasn't how humans had survived such a world, it was whether other species were ready to discover what they could become if they stopped hiding from the magnificent uncertainty of existence itself.